This podcast may contain disturbing content for some listeners. It's intended for mature audiences. Listener discretion is advised. This is True Crime XS.
I sent you a couple of links there because, some of the stuff I look at, I have trouble wrapping my head around what they're talking about. The first one is this lady. She's in her 60s. I believe this is all Nevada based. She went missing. Did you see this? That she went missing in February?
Yeah, I remember when it happened because, they were looking for her and she was found clinging on a tree that was down a steep cliff.
And were there pictures of it where she was being rescued? Because that's what I'm remembering.
Yeah, I think it's just when they were pulling her out. I don't know how long she was missing at that time, but she was found and except, for she was hypothermic, which had led her to be sort of unresponsive. And I don't know that they ever even determined how she ended up. I mean, they may have determined it, but the news sort of dropped off once she was found. But I don't know that they knew how she ended up clinging to the tree on the side of a cliff. Maybe she fell, or I don't know what happened, but it was basically this person's missing and then this person's been found on the side of a cliff, which is a strange set of events.
So what I read, and I don't know how this plays into it now, but what I read in the press release I read, it was really small. It said that she was a photographer, but I don't know if that's tied to the first incident or the second incident that they're saying that. They basically just said, she's a photographer and she does a little bit of traveling. Now, the first time they found her, it was around Valentine's Day, and she was in a hiking area near the Coughlin Ranch neighborhood. So I thought that was either her residence or somewhere nearby. And this is the one where she's found on the side of the slope or the cliff, hanging from the tree. And they bring her up. She makes a full recovery. But what's crazy is the story I just read you is because it leads off with, she is once again nowhere to be found. As of March 14th, she went missing in the Bypass Bridge area, that's like a parking and trailhead by the Hoover Dam, which is hundreds of miles away from where she lives in Reno. And apparently she had traveled to this area, also references she was taking photographs, and she didn't return to her vehicle. So this is Gail Stewart. She's 64 years old. And she has gone missing now twice in what is basically a month.
Yeah, there's something wrong with this situation. They didn't follow up the first time. What if it was a failed suicide attempt? If she's legitimately just taking pictures, I think that it's time to give up that hobby, or perhaps switch to portraiture, because it's not good. It's not going well for her. This is, I don't know that I've ever heard of somebody going missing exactly a month apart twice.
Well, I've read some weird missing persons cases over the years in the U.S. and other places where, I've read some of those anecdotal cases where somebody shows up to their own search party.
Right, they didn't know.
And they were not sure who they were looking for, but then they realized it was them.
And they were oh, wait, I'm right here.
Yeah. And then I read cases there was a case in mid-March where there's a Sacramento woman who went missing out in the Green Valley Trail area, and they found her deceased. So that sort of makes sense. But there was some kind of medical condition involved, and they don't really get specific, but you get the idea that either she passed away from the elements, or she went out there and passed away on purpose, I guess is the polite way to put it. Something happened to her. So I've read different ways that happened, but I've never read, I don't think, where someone went missing twice in the span of a month to the point that like there's, helicopters and search crews involved. But this Gail Stewart, she's 64 years old. She is missing apparently in the Hoover Dam area based on where her car is. She's described as having blonde hair and blue eyes. She's 5 feet 8 inches tall, weighs around 155 pounds. The last time she was seen, she was wearing a long sleeve black shirt with black leggings and black shoes. And she has gone missing before and been rescued. So
she may have some sort of she seems a little young for like dementia, but she may have some sort of cognitive issue that's causing disorientation or whatever. But how did they say how far away how far away was she?
It's hundreds of miles from her home this time.
Okay.
So Reno is where she's from, but where she went missing is the Hoover Dam, is supposedly, but it's about 400. My understanding is it's about 450 miles from her house to where she disappeared while taking photos at the Hoover Dam. I don't know if they literally mean she's a photographer or if they mean somebody saw her with a camera and then they didn't, because if that's the case, they saw her just taking pictures at the Hoover Dam. I mean, like my gut just says, well, I think she's in the water. I don't know how accurate that would be. I would not be very helpful.
Right. And these are the kind of cases where I have to at least think about the fact, at least consider that, she may have a problem. She may be having a mental problem, because,
there could be a legitimate health problem going on too, I guess.
Well, sure. But, if she fell off the cliff but survived the fall and now she ends up in the Hoover Dam drowned, I mean, it might have been the first disappearance might have been a failed suicide attempt.
Well, I mean...
And she was like, well, I guess I got to go somewhere where I can get a better result. And so water it was. I'm just saying, that's what goes through my mind. The other thing is, perhaps she is just a photographer who doesn't have good navigation skills and she gets lost.
Yeah.
But the first time, though, I think it was mentioned that there was no reason she should have ended up where she was. It wasn't part of a path or anything.
Yeah.
And it was a very strange situation that she had ended up so far down on the cliff. And it wasn't something that would have just happened without some sort of, either purposeful or accidental effort, right?
Yeah.
But I hope she's found. I hope somebody will, if she is found safely, I hope she's found safely. And if she is, I hope somebody will suggest to her to take a buddy with her, because I believe she doesn't have her phone with her. There's all kinds of technology out there now for people to, beyond just your cell phone, you can get a locator beacon. I think she needs to invest in one of these because, and I'm not saying she's not worth it, but it cost a fortune to go find people, right? In resources that are used. I could see this grating on someone's nerves pretty bad. Of course, again, she didn't report herself missing, so it's not necessarily her fault. But I'll be interested to see how this turns out. She's been missing for 9 days now.
At the Hoover Dam area, yep.
Yeah, so, I mean, that doesn't seem good. I don't know exactly how long she was missing last time. Do you?
Last time, it wasn't so much missing as it was... the rescue situation happened during the search. My understanding was the last time this happened wasn't that long, between the time she went missing in February to the time that she was found. I was trying to pull that up really.
Everything skews, though, because she is missing again. It's she's missing again, so you can't find the original information.
So the original information was that She was rescued Monday night around February 15th, 2022. She had been missing since 10 a.m. Yeah, so this is like a same day kind of thing.
Yeah, so this is more serious. And 9 days, she's probably, I don't think she could have survived that long. And I assume it's
I would have to
cool
see
there.
the weather. Yeah, I would have to see the weather for the last few days. But yeah, it's definitely, I mean, it's better than February.
Yeah, I guess, but I feel like she would have died from hypothermia. Even if she wasn't in the water, it would be cold. So
Yeah, so there's that case. If anybody's seen her, just type in Gail Stewart Hoover Dam, and you can find a little more information about the case, and you can find the appropriate National Park Service number to call related to her. I didn't get a good one. Everyone I looked at was like a paper looking for it, and I was like, this is not good. There was another case that came up. This is an arrest, and it's one of those in Washington. When we did Israel Keys, I got really obsessed with like different areas of Washington. And this one, I looked at this area. This is in like the Spokane area where this guy got arrested. It's related to Pullman, Washington, and it's right in the Keys timeline. It's these home invasions and sexual assaults from November of 2003 through, they happened until like early 2005. But they've like pulled some of them to the side, and they have arrested a married construction worker in Washington state on two of those counts. One is a November 2003 case, and the other is a March 2004 case in Pullman, Washington. So this is one of those where they put together DNA matches. They used evidence that was collected at the time from the crime scenes, and they just sort of worked their way through the process to where they came up on somebody's forensic genetic genealogy list. So they linked 47-year-old Kenneth David Downing, who would have been in his 20s when this happened. Like, that's a really long time ago. His bail's been set at $5 million. They charged him with 2 home invasions and sexual assaults. These victims merited him 4 counts of rape and 3 counts of assault. There's a couple other charges in there. And these victims would have been about 5 months apart, give or take. So prosecutors said that one of the women told investigators that the suspect sexually assaulted her 3 times during the attack and even made small talk at one point about her pets. And 18 years later, she says she's still living in fear. Months after that attack, authorities said that he broke into another woman's apartment and raped her at knife point after tying up and assaulting her roommate. Cops took evidence from both crime scenes, according to the New York Post, and they entered that DNA into a genealogy database. And that ultimately led them to Downing after one of his relatives sent in a sample to inquire about their lineage. So this is through like a GEDmatch thing. Downing faces up to life in prison if convicted. He told a judge he's a married man with several children who's been living in the area for the last decade. Pullman police declined to identify the site where Downing was arrested, as well as which company he was working for at the time. But it did say he was arrested at a construction site. Sergeant Aaron Brashears with the Pullman police said, "I think it's important that after 18 years, our victims here in Pullman now can have some closure. They don't have to worry about this guy running around out there still." And it says that the Pullman police partnered with a private company in 2020 to take a look at the cold case and identified a family tree that narrowed down their search significantly. Brashears continues, "Rather than a needle in the haystack, we now had a family to look at as far as suspects based upon the forensic genetic genealogy." Downing pled not guilty. He was assigned a court-appointed attorney and is due back in court in March to have another little hearing on this. It's going to be an interesting one.
I don't think that he's going to make bail.
No, he's not going to make bail on that.
We've talked about a lot of DNA closings on cases, and I really like it when there's DNA evidence because it seems to be, if it's not foolproof, it's at least like really easily disputable in that all you have to do is like not match the DNA sample, right?
Yeah.
And so this case is a little late. I'm really surprised. 18 years ago, somebody would have thought that they weren't leaving something behind.
I don't. Yeah, I'm with you on that. I mean, you sort of looked at it, and I think your first response was, "I wonder what's going through his mind," or
No,
something
I
like
think
that.
that he's probably denying. I think that he would be denying it. That's just my like speculative impression of seeing the face that they published with the article. He's like, I didn't do it, like really surprised.
Yeah,
But then when you said the dates, it was weird because to me that's late. Because I'm thinking more like late 80s, early 90s. But obviously, if people living with crimes that they've committed at this point, like in 2022, there's nothing they can do about evidence they left behind back then, right?
right.
And so, maybe he wasn't aware that it could be traced, but maybe because he got away with it for so long, he's surprised that it's now, because what led to this wasn't a CODIS hit. It was somebody in his family getting a commercial DNA test done, right?
Yeah,
But without that, his DNA wouldn't have popped anywhere, so to speak. And, all the legalities are surrounding that. Essentially, what they do is they treat that like a lead, and they use the DNA that was gathered from the crime scene to compare against a probably court ordered with a search warrant DNA
yeah.
sample
They're
from
they're
him.
backing up what they did.
And so, that whole maybe so maybe he would have been aware he was leaving it behind, but it wasn't commercial DNA testing was a thing at that point yet. I definitely don't think they weren't using it like splicing it into criminal investigations. That's for sure. Not that far back.
Yeah, I mean, so Ancestry was the one I think of, and they were founded in the 90s, but we didn't like these links weren't made like this. So I think it's a mixture of the two things. I think more than likely, so there's an hour and a half, give or take, between where he was living now and where these attacks had occurred. He might have thought, I'm far enough away that they'll never have a reason to test me against that. I think he looked surprised. I think he looked like, wait, what? And like, I think he was surprised that he got caught for that. But I look at those cases and I think you know this about me. I always wonder, like, what else did that dude do during that time period? And like, did he escalate further? Because like, I have a really hard time believing that people who do the types of assaults where you're going through the trouble of like going into a house, restraining people. In one of these cases, he assaulted and restrained the other roommate. And I have a problem believing that people who go to that trouble just one day go, well, I had my term as a serial rapist. I'm done. I don't think that's what happens. I picture them escalating and deciding they don't want to leave witnesses behind.
But my initial impression is that serial rapists are acting out in a situational context.
Okay.
I could be wrong. It's just my opinion. Because typically, while most serial killers, actually, I would say just about all of them, have the capability of being a rapist as well, all rapists aren't killers.
Yeah.
Without question. And so I do think there's cases where it escalates, but do I think this guy could be a two and done situation? Well, I don't know, but it seems to me like if they could connect him to those two cases, that, any other case that has DNA available, I mean, he's going into CODIS now, so the connections will be made if there was evidence kept.
The court documents, I tried to pop in on the Zoom hearing for this. So the first instance, a woman woke up in her bedroom with a man in her house with a gun. He walked her through the house, sexually assaulted her 3 times, and told her that if she ran, she would regret it. He told her when he was leaving that if she reported it to anybody, that he would be back within 2 months and that he knew people, whatever that means. She's still concerned today. In addition, when she checked to see if he had left, He came back in the house and sexually assaulted her again. So that was that's the November 2003 instance. The second instance in March of 2004, two women returned to their home to find a man with a gun inside. He used the gun to again sexually assault one of the women and bind the other woman. When they told him that if he used the gun that people would hear it, then he pulled out a knife and said, "I'll use this too." And the prosecutor just reiterated this is very serious, very dangerous, very violent crimes. And they gave him a public defender, and he's been living in this area. The little town he lives in is called Elk, Washington. He's been living there for the last 10 years. They were kind of using that to be like, oh, he's not going to run away. He ends up with 13 counts of rape, felony assault with a sexual motivation, unlawful imprisonment with a sexual motivation, and burglary with sexual motivation. And as of right now, if convicted, he faces life in prison. I do not think he had any idea that he was going to be caught.
Maybe not. And it does sound a lot more brutal in that account of everything. It would definitely be something. I think that he will just deny it, and that we won't ever. I think he'll end up, going to trial and denying it, and we won't ever really know the motivation there, which I think is a little bit unfortunate. I mean, you can't really say like, well, why don't you forego your ability to plead not guilty and just tell us about this, right? Because I'd like to know why you did what you did, and, what stopped you or what propelled you further. It doesn't seem like that's going to be, I mean, it may be, but I feel like we should study as many of these guys as we can.
Yeah. So, all right, this one, I went back in time for this one. I pulled a newspaper archive article from September 25th, 2004, and I was going to pass this on to you before we get into our main case. Pullman police are seeking information regarding a serial rapist armed with a gun who entered the homes of women on Pioneer Hill in August of 2003, again in November of 2003, and in March of this year. The man is described as a white male, 5 feet 2 inches tall to 5 feet 7 inches tall. He's got a slender build, and he's in his mid-20s. They got a terrible sketch on here. I don't know if you saw that, but it's like a guy in a ski mask. Over the summer, we got back results from physical evidence, and the DNA confirms our belief that it's the same person in the different cases. So nowhere in here do they mention this August 2003 case, by the way.
That's interesting. Has it been solved otherwise?
I don't know. That's what I was going to go hunting for that.
I would like to hope that since you found it, they would find it too.
Yeah. So Weatherly, William Weatherly is the police chief of Pullman at the time. He says, "I have a strong feeling he will reoffend either here or somewhere. So there may be a match in the future from him. The police have had a professional profiler who works with the department in the Tri-Cities area consult on the Pullman cases. Profiler thinks the guy is likely not a student, but he's in his 20s, and we certainly don't rule out the possibility that he is a student. Police now believe the Pullman cases are not linked to serial rapes that were occurring in Coeur d'Alene area. These were some Idaho cases that were occurring in 2002 and 2003. The two common denominators in the 3 Pullman cases are that each involved either women who live alone or share a house with another woman, and the fact that the perpetrator seemed familiar with the women's habits. He probably observed them over time. He seemed familiar with their habits of coming and going and so forth," said Weatherly. The man entered homes through unsecured windows or doors, so police continue to emphasize the importance of locking all points of entrances to the home. And we want to hear from people who see a man acting in any suspicious way. We'd rather check out 1,000 things that turn out to be nothing than miss him because someone was reluctant to call. The profiler has said that he doesn't think the rapist is likely to escalate his level of violence. He carries a gun, and from what I know of things, he could go further, said Weatherly. He emphasized the importance of calling the police as soon as possible after any sexual assault. Evidence collection becomes more difficult or impossible as time passes. Think of footprints that are preserved in the dew. As the sun hits the dew, they start to fade. As more time passes since the last case involving this rapist, Pullman residents are growing hopeful that he's left the area. But we don't know that until and unless he's apprehended, said Weatherly. Meanwhile, we've got to all keep this guy in mind. And that's from September 25th, 2004. That's Kirsten Peters writing for the Moscow Pullman Daily News about this case It turns out to be Downing, but it's not going to be solved for 20 years. It's wild.
It is wild, and man, it's just so interesting. All that's so interesting. I remember perusing those cases, I think, because I was looking for probably keys, I imagine.
Yeah. We have a stack of them. So the reason this guy, when I say this guy, I didn't know it was Downing or anyone like Downing. The reason this set of cases falls off my radar, I don't know, back in 2014, maybe 2015, I stopped looking at this set because there's actually 5 of them. Even though I mentioned 3 there were 5 in this area that take place. Problem with them was the suspect is listed as under 5 feet 8 inches tall in all 5 of them.
He was too short, yeah.
And he was described as slender or stocky, and nothing else stood out about him. And honestly, the sketches just didn't look like anything I would expect of Israel Keyes. So
yeah, they didn't, and they do actually sort of look like this guy, though.
Yeah, a little bit. They do look a little bit like
Of course,
him.
this is 20 years later, so
yeah, I don't know what he appeared like at the time, but it definitely could have been. So we promised to go back and wrap up D'Ellen, Bella, Sandy Dial, Don Dial case. This case took one of the weirdest turns for me. So first of all, don't have to summarize it again. You can listen to the last 2 Out of the Blue episodes where D'Ellen Bella had basically murdered her friend in an insurance scheme, and she drugged some other people in with her. This is a long time ago that this happened. As of this writing, it's basically 32, 33 years ago. It was in 1991, so it'd be 31 years there. I'll do math for this episode. It's you can see pictures of all of them online if you go to the Dallas Magazine or dmagazine.com. And when we left off, we pointed out that Don Dial and D'Ellen Bella both got really long sentences in prison. And when I think of that, I think to myself, okay, good. If they're the right people, then like nobody else is going to die. And we did talk a little bit about some of the people in the family thinking that largely there was no way possible that Don Dial could have done this. Now, they don't really speak up for Ellen. They just speak up for Don and whether or not he could participate. Do you picture them being able to commit a lot more crimes when I say that they're basically doing life in prison in a place that doesn't give parole?
They being D'Ellen and Don?
In this case, yeah.
I think that I don't know about Don. I feel like it was D'Ellen's manipulation over him that if he was involved, I think that's why. But I think D'Ellen would continue on unless she can find some sort of non-violent way to continue her manipulation. She's going to do it again. I don't know, like, to what extent. I don't know that she would kill somebody again. She technically wasn't actually punished for the murder anyway, so...
Yeah, well, we don't know that she necessarily pulled the trigger. We just know that she was involved in the insurance side of it.
I 100% believe that she could have pulled the trigger. I'm not saying she did. She hasn't been, but I believe that, she could have. And I believe that, there might have been a little bit of animosity because Sandy was Don's ex-sister-in-law. So she had been married to his brother. And that might have been enough to want revenge or whatever. But there's no direct link that Don was going to be getting any of the insurance money, right? There's nothing, he didn't have a policy on her or anything. But we do know that the accounts of the story, there was somebody else involved because of the way the cars drove up. 2 people were driving, and it was, I believe, pretty much established that Sandy didn't drive herself there, right? She had already been shot in the back of her car at that point, and somebody else was driving the vehicle. And I believe it's because it had rained the Thursday night before. The footprints were in the mud, indicating that the driver had gotten out and walked around. And so there was a whole story laid out there that indicated from everything we could see that Sandy didn't drive her own car there. She was already laying in the back seat dead or dying, that means somebody else had to be involved. I haven't ever seen anybody offer anybody else, because D'Ellen and Don were dating at the time. And so nobody's ever said, like, well, maybe it was this other person, right?
Well, there's an indication that Lynn is involved, but they kind of limit that to him being involved more on the paperwork side of things, like to do with the death certificates and things like that. But they don't go any further. And ultimately, while he was indicted, he's not convicted. In fact, he doesn't even go to trial. They drop the charges against Lynn, who is Don's brother and Sandy's ex-husband and the father for children.
I'm not sure he was involved. I don't know. The thought was she was about to change the recipient of the life insurance, but like, I mean, he seems to have taken care of these girls, right?
Yeah, and they don't think he was involved, and they don't think that Uncle Don was involved. So I have, like, I've known about this case for a long time. We're covering this case because, like, it's one of those that it does have one little mystery that, like, makes me scratch my head. And that is, was there another person? And not Lynn, not Don. I'm saying, like, I think you and I are both in agreement that while D'Ellen Bella orchestrated this and was probably the centerpiece for the conspiracy, just based on how she's involved with the insurance side of it and getting Sandy to come over to her house and her relationship with Sandy and the way that she acted after Sandy went missing and was ultimately found murdered, the question becomes, like, could there have been another person? I have wondered, like, realistically, like, could there have been somebody else?
So there were people that might have been part of driving the vehicle. Okay, right. So I take all that I said about Don back, and it is. I feel like that's a very steep slope there. When you start, I mean, okay, while it is logical that the partner of a person, like 99% of the time, would be responsible for their demise, you have to keep in mind they had children, they didn't get along, but they were already divorced. Right. But for this life insurance policy, that wasn't a whole lot of money. And I'm talking about the one that Sandy legitimately had through her work or whatever. Like, I just don't think a father would take his children's mother away for that, especially considering he went on to raise them as, I mean, he was remarried, but he took care of his girls. And so you're not looking at a situation where there's a couple trying to break up and somebody's trying to get out of a relationship. Their relationship was over. Right? Yeah. If he was to kill their mother or be part of it, it's just pouring salt on a wound. And Don Dial was their uncle, so it would be the same sort of thing with him. And so, you know what? It may not be him.
Well, so that question comes up, and I had pointed out in the last episode that D'Ellen Bella was active on social media to some degree. We don't know who necessarily was running the account, which you had pointed out. But she definitely was proclaiming her innocence to some degree. Here is probably the weirdest part of this story. She had a prison boyfriend. And I don't know if people, were you familiar with that? Like, have you been familiar with that idea? Like, people, like, writing to prisoners?
I'm aware that it happens.
Yeah. So it's a very common occurrence that people on the outside of prison will go on to, now it's websites. It used to be, and I don't know if you remember this, there used to be a little magazine that you could get, and it was like a newspaper print on the inside, but it would just have hundreds of not articles, but like almost like classified personals ads where you could pick a dude and write to them, or pick a girl and write to them, and you could, like, they tell you a little bit about their story, but you're basically writing a pen pal. You're basically writing a number that you have read a paragraph about them, and you're starting a pen pal relationship with someone who is behind bars for whatever reason.
I feel like that's a really bad idea.
It is a bad idea. So not only is it a bad idea, it brings us to the next part of our story. And this is again with Glenna Whitley from D Magazine. She's the one who's been writing about D'Ellen and Sandy and Janet all this time. And this is a little bit different story. This is a story about a man who lived across the country to more easily visit his prison girlfriend, who he had signed over his entire estate to. At the time we pick up this story, it's a chilly night in January of 2013, and the man, Harold Henry, has thrown all the letters from her, for some reason, into a garbage bag with trash. It's not like he's packing it, taking it with him. He had once been charmed and found his girlfriend very funny and enjoyed her flattery, but he was sick of it. He was leaving. And Harold Henry has packed his car, his pots, his pans, his towels, his sheets, and his Western snap shirts that he wears. And he's leaving. They began their relationship when he answered an ad for a prison pen pal 15 years ago. A retired rancher, he'd moved from South Dakota to live in Gatesville, Texas, where his life revolved around visiting her in prison. The woman who's serving time for conspiracy to commit capital murder. He believed that one day that he, Harold Henry, and D'Ellen Bella would live together. But on that chilly evening in January 2013, when 76-year-old Harold Henry was ready to split, he'd decided that he'd been played for a fool. He was going to hit the road early the next morning after meeting with his good friend Charles Hines at McDonald's for coffee. They were both enamored of younger women who were serving time. At the time, Charles had even married his prison girlfriend, Carlene Easley, who had killed her fifth husband with several blasts from a single-shot shotgun. Harold had made his prison girlfriend the sole heir to his estate. But the next morning, Harold didn't show up for coffee, so Charles walked a couple of blocks to Harold's apartment. He found his friend had collapsed on the threshold of his front door, fully dressed, still wearing his eyeglasses. Charles raced back to the McDonald's to enlist help from some soldiers eating breakfast. A Gatesville police officer arrived at 6:18 a.m., followed by paramedics. By then, Harold was dead. His son, Dallas Henry, got the news about an hour later. He called the manager at his father's apartment complex and he said, "Get my dad's trash." A maintenance man stored the bags for Dallas until he arrived a few days later. A justice of the peace ruled that Harold's death was not the result of foul play. But Dallas and Deb Berner, Harold's daughter, didn't believe it. Their dad was a health nut. He never drank, he never smoked, and the only medication he ever took was for high blood pressure. But they knew about his friend in prison. Why would a church-going teetotaler become obsessed with a killer? Dallas eventually got the justice of peace to order a toxicology screen. And the results showed that Harold's system contained enough Benadryl to kill a horse. It was odd. Police found no Benadryl bottle in Harold's apartment. And Deb noticed other details in the police report that raised serious questions. Harold had 2 phones, but neither one was ever found. He left a note scrawled in black marker, "I think I'm having a heart attack. Cremate me." But the black marker was never found. Where were her dad's phones? Who would write a note like that while having a heart attack? And what about the missing marker that had been used to write it? The more Deb asked questions from South Dakota, the more she frustrated the law enforcement in Gatesville. There was an episode of a true crime show starring Erin Brockovich, and at the center of the tale was a woman who'd orchestrated a 1991 murder in North Texas to collect on an insurance policy. Her name was D'Ellen Bella, Harold's prison girlfriend. So Deb would come to learn how that killing 22 years earlier was tied to her father's death. And with her help and that of others, Dallas Magazine has obtained letters and audio interviews of D'Ellen, as well as official documents related to the investigation into Harold's death, which reveals a con artist still working her schemes, even behind bars. Okay, so the next part of the story that's in the articles here, it's about Sandy's murder, and I've already told everyone about that. But where I do want to pick up is at the end of this, relevant to what happened to Harold. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about Harold. D'Ellen Bella wrote, I am a woman of fairly high intelligence, lots of common sense, and I understand most humor. I read a lot, I listen to music, I dabble with poetry. I'm Christian, and I'm seeking a long-term pen pal friendship to share thoughts, hopes, and dreams. I prefer men over 50 years to correspond with that are also intelligent, with common sense, are Christians, and stable. And the ad said that she was 51, although she was really 47. And it listed her projected out date as October of 2009. The ad with D'Ellen's smiling photograph popped up on the computer screen of a retired rancher from South Dakota. My prayer for you tonight and every night from now on will be that you're safe, strong, healthy, and happy, and that you go to bed each night with peace in your heart and mind, and that you wake each morning filled with love and hope and a beautiful smile on your handsome face. This is from D'Ellen Bella to Harold Henry on January 16th of 2005. The only child of a former rodeo cowboy, Harold grew up in the West Texas town of Roby, which was not far from Abilene. But when Harold was 12, his father took a hunting trip to South Dakota and fell in love with the land. He bought a ranch and began raising cattle, farming wheat and corn. And once Harold had his own family, he did the same, rising with the sun and toiling late in the field 7 days a week, while neglecting his two kids, Deb and Dallas. His frugality was legendary. In the early 1980s, Harold sold his cattle. He sat inside all winter, getting on his wife's nerves and vice versa. And finally, he filed for divorce, and their legal battle was like the War of the Roses, says his daughter, Deb. Sitting in her tidy house in Watertown, South Dakota, which has a large metal sunflower on the front door, Deb shows the author several boxes containing material related to her father's death that she had collected in the past 6 years. In many ways, she's like Janet Hawley, methodical, relentless, a farm girl who now works as a medical transcriber. Deb admits that she's annoyed several investigators, but she can't let go of the odd circumstances surrounding her father's death. Despite their strange relationship in his last years, Deb felt that she had to find out what really happened. She felt she owed her father that. After the divorce, Harold had an estate worth about $500,000. He should have been able to live out his life in peace, but South Dakota winters, when the snow piled up to the eaves, always got Harold down. One year, he spent time in a hospital for seasonal depression. He started going to Texas for a few months in the mid-90s to escape those dark days, but he'd return to South Dakota in the spring and summer, helping Dallas on the farm, getting to know his grandchildren. Dallas says, my dad was a better grandfather than a father. Dallas's wife, Lori, has a degree in psychology. She found him warm and helpful around the farm, always interested in alternative health topics. In 1998 or so, Harold, who was then in his early 60s, confided to Lori that he had a new woman in his life. Dee, as he called her, could do anything. She could knit, she could crochet, she was learning Braille so she could help others. She could almost be a lawyer because she had extensive knowledge of the law, especially insurance law. He showed Lori a picture of Dee, and Lori's first thought was, what does this polished woman want with a redneck farmer from South Dakota? Harold told Lori about a book company that Dee had gotten involved with. He wanted Dallas and Lori to invest $3,000, and the payoffs would be huge, she said. Lori declined. She found her father-in-law kind-hearted but gullible, and wondered why Harold never brought Dee with him to visit them. And then in 2003, Dallas and Lori were watching TV when they saw an episode of Final Justice with Aaron Brockovich titled Deadly Insurance about the murder of Sandy Dial. Dallas and Lori recognized the picture of the woman who'd orchestrated the killing. It was Harold's girlfriend. They immediately called Deb. Deb phoned her father to warn him, but he brushed her off, saying that Dee was innocent and would soon be out of prison. After a lifetime of farming, he'd lost his purpose. Now, apparently, Harold had seized on a new job, proving D'Ellen's innocence. D'Ellen later told an investigator that Harold had answered her pen pal ad in 1998 and had first visited her in prison in February of 2000. In taped interviews, he comes across as a straight talker with a flirtatious laugh and solicitous manner, often bringing up sex. She was 21 years younger than Harold. The beginning of their relationship was a classic romance scam. Harold committed himself to D'Ellen and her cause, and on his own initiative, he hired Walter Reeves Jr., a Waco attorney known across the state, to appeal her conviction. He drove the attorney crazy, D'Ellen said, calling and visiting his office. D'Ellen's appeal was denied on May 3, 2000, and Reeves had exhausted legal remedies by early 2005. Deb and Dallas had no idea how deeply their father was involved with D'Ellen. In addition to paying her a prominent appeals attorney, he put $200 a month into her commissary fund. He likely paid for the publication of a book called Tea Please, with recipes, drawings, and poetry by D'Ellen. She also had a BBVA Compass savings account in which he deposited checks. Harold's relationship with his children became strained. Although unwilling to help Deb, he often talked of D'Ellen's daughter, Pretty Little Shell. They'd met in 2005 when Michelle traveled to Gatesville to visit her mother in prison. That year, he took a bus to South Dakota and retrieved an '89 Oldsmobile that he'd loaned to Dallas for ferrying kids to daycare, and he drove it back to Texas for Michelle to use. He told Dallas that Michelle, training to become a midwife, was struggling and needed the car more than he did. This didn't square with Michelle's later statement to investigators. She claimed that Harold had asked her to sell the car for him. She had no idea that he didn't get the money. D'Ellen told a different story. He didn't give Shell that stupid car. He gave the car to me. She thought she was getting out of prison and needed a vehicle. But with her appeals exhausted, Michelle got rid of it. Harold had finagled his way into a low-income apartment in Gatesville. It was a dump, but he didn't care. Harold would drive 30 miles for a free meal. But he gave D'Ellen money monthly and more. He told friends that they'd live together when she got out. Trained as a Braille transcriber, she could earn up to $100,000 per year, and she'd reimburse him. He wrote Deb, "She'll be proven innocent. It's very possible that Dee could make Dallas a millionaire and provide education for all three of our grandkids." So she's just running the same damn scheme. She has not even updated her scheme. In June 2003, 5 years after he'd begun corresponding with D'Ellen, Harold revised his will and left his estate to her, omitting his own children. Dallas found the documents in his father's car, but neither Dallas nor Deb confronted him. In 2008, Harold sent D'Ellen the paperwork for an annuity that would be worth $164,000 on maturity, promising it would be hers when he died. That went into her prison file. D'Ellen became eligible for parole for the first time in 2009. Harold hired another attorney, Paige Massey, out of Austin, Texas. Harold had no idea that D'Ellen was anticipating a different life on the outside. In August of 2009, D'Ellen posted this on writeaprisoner.com. In search of fun, relaxing, entertaining conversations, I'm seeking friendship with the option of a serious relationship if the opportunity presents itself. I enjoy palm reading, the arts, good food, good wine, good company, family, and friends. I'm very romantic, passionate, and affectionate, and easy to talk to. While incarcerated, I've accomplished many skills that will allow me to have a successful career, be my own boss, and lead a very happy, independent life. At 50, I'm a beautiful woman looking forward to discovering the zest of life again. I'd love to have a good friend to share with dreams, hopes, laughs, tears, and goals. Friendship is not bound by age or gender. D'Ellen was seeking her next sugar daddy, or maybe even a sugar mama. But Janet, thinking of her sister Sandy and that shotgun blast, was determined to block D'Ellen's release. By then, Janet had returned to school, earned a paralegal degree, and landed a job preparing trial evidence for the U.S. Attorney's Office. Victims and their families have the right to file confidential protest against the pending release of convicted felons. Janet posted the Brockovich episode on YouTube to draw attention to the case, and she rallied her friends to send letters to the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles. Finally, she requested and received permission to make a personal presentation to the board. Ranger Anderson made the trip to Gatesville with her. Janet asked that D'Ellen be given a 5-year set-off date because their crime had been committed with a deadly weapon, and D'Ellen's parole request was denied. The set-off was granted, meaning she would not be eligible for review again until 2014. With 5 more years to work, D'Ellen came up with a new scheme. A few months after D'Ellen's parole request was denied, Janet was contacted by an American woman living in London named Sunday Osborne. Sunday was a screenwriter and wanted to acquire the rights to Janet's life story. How, as a house cleaner, she'd helped solve her sister's murder, and then gone on to work for the U.S. Attorney's Office. After checking out Sunday's credentials, Janet agreed. She packaged up documents, including her confidential presentation to the parole board and DVDs of the Brockovich show, and she mailed the box to Sunday. At Sunday's urging, she wrote out her story and sent it by email. A few weeks later, in early 2010, Janet discovered the website DeEllenBella.com. It proclaimed DeEllen's innocence and trashed Sandy as having been promiscuous. According to DeEllen, everyone involved in the investigation in her trial was corrupt or incompetent. One entry promised a video of the crime scene, which would prove her version of events would be uploaded soon. On the same day that Janet found that site, Sunday emailed her to say that the DVD of the Brockovich show, which included video footage of the crime scene, was blank. Sunday asked Janet to resend it. Janet's research showed that DeEllenBella.com was registered in the UK. She quickly took down the YouTube video and revoked the contract with Sunday. Sunday told the author of this article she did try to contact DeEllen to learn more about her motivations and background, but she had not responded. She insists that she never spoke to DeEllen or to her daughter, nor did she show anyone else the material that Janet had sent her, not even her agent. I can't stress enough how much I respect Janet, Sunday says. What struck me was her determination to get to the truth. I would never do anything to compromise the case. But Janet found the coincidences unnerving, and the UK domain was transferred to Juanita Gober of Asheville, North Carolina. DeEllen's daughter Michelle lived at the address listed for Juanita Gober and posted and sold photographs to Juanita James. Michelle also established RealWorldVoice.com, a website behind a petition to abolish the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles, singling out DeEllen's Waco attorney, Walter Reeves Jr., as outlaw number one for botching her case, and many others, in addition to maintaining her mother's website. Michelle began to design web pages for other inmates for $350.
Like, how can this get any worse?
It's so crazy.
I wasn't entirely sure if Sunday Osborne was part of this scheme or not.
I never really get to the bottom of Sunday.
Because there's some ambiguity there, but then it seems like the author of this particular article, independently verified that it wasn't a person pretending to be another person or whatever.
Well, so Sunday Osborne is a real screenwriter, and I did a little background work on Sunday. The thing about people in the film industry, and this is me being as polite as humanly possible, they are really put in a position where they are trying to get their own career started. And Sunday, her career is only about 3 credits long as far as the movie business goes. She was actually in the costume department as a production assistant on the 1990 film Pretty Woman. And then she has 1 credit as a screenwriter on a short film from 2011 called The Visit. So Sunday's real, and Sunday is really trying to be a part of the movie industry.
Right, and she's in London, and the website
is registered there, yeah.
So, I mean, coincidence?
Well, I will leave that up to other folks.
Yeah, because it's not decided. No. There's no, this author just presents sort of both sides of it for us to just wonder about.
Yes. Deb was driving her daughter to summer camp in 2011 when Harold called her. Harold tells her that there's a man coming to South Dakota to kill Harold's family unless he wires him $50,000. And Deb says that Harold sounded scared. Deb calls the FBI in Waco, and a female agent calls her back, and she tells Deb that the caller is a scammer. And she says, the FBI agent says, do not give him any money. But of course, Harold did it anyways. About 6 months later, so this is the end of 2011, Harold's mother, Ruby, is on her deathbed, and the family asked Harold to come to South Dakota, and he kept giving excuses. So finally, February 1st, 2012, Ruby dies without seeing Harold. On the day of Ruby's funeral, Harold phones his son Dallas and asks if they could postpone the ceremony and maybe just put Mom into a freezer until the spring. Dallas refuses, and Harold breaks down crying, saying, "Someone is threatening to shoot me if I leave my house."
So this poor man has lost his mind.
Yeah, he's lost his mind. And this is an older guy. He has absolutely lost his mind at this point. I think he would have been 74 when this was going on, 74, 75. Dallas asked his father to sign a form giving his children the power of attorney in case he was ever incapacitated, and he agreed. The paperwork took a few months, and when it came through, Deb checked her father's bank account. He'd had no money to come to South Dakota to see his mother before her death. Harold was absolutely broke. By this point, between the supposed death threats and the empty bank account, Deb knew something had to be done, so she called the prison. They told her to call the police, and the police said to call the prison. So in desperation, she finally called Adult Protective Services. And a social worker visited Harold, who said that D'Ellen had taken him off of her visitors list. He said that he needed to fix the mess that his daughter had created by asking questions. He wrote D'Ellen, promising that more money would be coming in. He said that he was due oil royalties from a deceased cousin, but that wasn't enough. He was supposed to take out a life insurance policy on himself that benefited D'Ellen, and then she'd get back with him. The social worker told this to Daryl. Harold followed through by getting a physical as a first step. On hearing this, Deb contacted the Gatesville police about D'Ellen. Since her reason for incarceration is similar to this, she said, "We're very concerned that she's setting him up and he will have some sort of accident if he gets this life insurance policy." The detective suggested she contact the prison and asked to be put in touch with an internal affairs investigator. D'Ellen assured the prison investigator that any financial help provided by Harold was voluntary. To prove it, she not only had years of letters, but also his will and the annuity documents in her prison file. The social worker learned that Harold had agreed to pay more legal fees. D'Ellen's sister, who was a woman named Judy Stevens, had hired Mike Ware, a Fort Worth attorney associated with the Innocence Project of Texas. Harold volunteered to pay half of Ware's $50,000 fee. Judy would pay the rest. Judy told the author that she believes that D'Ellen is innocent, and she blamed Janet, the jealous sister, for D'Ellen's wrongful conviction. Deb discovered that Harold had written 2 checks prior to his mother's death to someone named Stephanie Martin, each for $12,500. Deb could find no attorney in Texas by that name, but it turned out that Stephanie Martin's full name was Stephanie Nicole Stevens Martin, and this was Judy's daughter. In other words, Harold was writing checks to D'Ellen's niece. At one point, Harold called Noble Walker, the Hunt County District Attorney, to advocate for D'Ellen. "I think he genuinely believed an innocent person was in the penitentiary," says Walker. "I wish I'd listened to Mr. Harold a little better, but it was over. All the appeals were exhausted." No new evidence had emerged, and D'Ellen had promised Harold that a DNA test would free her. But there was no DNA to test. Now, Harold was wavering. D'Ellen had lied about the DNA, and she'd lied about the money. Harold was due a refund of $7,500 from the estate of Paige Massey, the Austin attorney that he'd hired for D'Ellen's first parole hearing. Paige Massey had committed suicide in late 2009. The refund ended up being sent to D'Ellen's savings account. D'Ellen told Harold he'd approved that arrangement. "Trust, trust, trust," Harold wrote at the top of a letter he sent to D'Ellen in December of 2012, about a month before his death. "Why are you broke at the end of the month and Shell does not have money to visit you? Here is $50 to write and explain yourself. You can trust me. How can I trust you all the money I have spent on you?" The social worker talked to Harold's doctor, and at his physical for the insurance policy, Harold's doctor had detected signs of dementia. On January 15th of 2013, the doctor executed a physician statement of capacity or incapacity, certifying Harold as incompetent with regard to his finances. Deb called her father numerous times the next day, but he didn't answer. He returned her call on Thursday, January the 17th, and said, "Everything is going to be okay in just about a week," Harold said, and he sounded chipper. There's a quote in here that I'm going to put up. It says, I hope that you're not destitute like Deb says. I thought you still had the large annuity, plus now your royalties from oil. I need to be informed about what you're doing. I'm having a hard time without your help in my life. There is not a limit on the amount of money you deposit in my bank account. If you do make a deposit, will you please do it in cash? I really don't need any more problems. This is a note from Dee Ellen that she wrote to Harold Henry on January the 10th of 2013. The Gatesville JP initially declined Dallas's request for an autopsy following Harold's death, but after the toxicology test, he got his wish. The autopsy showed that Harold had suffered a neck injury and that his stomach contained bright green material and 355 milligrams of the active ingredient in Benadryl. So in addition to the Benadryl that he had already worked its way into his system, which was found in his toxicology test, there was the equivalent of more than a dozen Benadryl tablets still in his stomach. The antihistamine could have interacted with metoprolol, a drug that Harold took for high blood pressure, and had a fatal side effect. The medical examiner ruled his death accidental. But Deb wasn't buying it. Lori, her sister-in-law, clearly recalled Harold's telling her about 3 weeks before his death that he didn't like Benadryl because of the side effects, not to mention the fact that no Benadryl packaging was found at his apartment, and that a cremate me note, and that he told his social worker about Dee Ellen pressuring him to take out a life insurance policy and name her as the beneficiary. Finally, a questionable death investigation was opened by a Gatesville police lieutenant named David Inocencio. He was joined about a month later by Texas Ranger Jason Bobo. But Deb got the impression that Lieutenant Inocencio wasn't seriously considering foul play. 3 years earlier, after watching the Brockovich show, Deb had contacted Janet. She was largely responsible for putting Dee Ellen behind bars, but Janet never replied. So, with Deb's frustration growing, she tried her again, and she got a response. As the two women talked on the phone comparing notes, they came to see that the deaths of their loved ones were strangely intertwined. Among Harold's effects was a photo of Dee Ellen and Don, and a photocopy of the sister card from Dee Ellen to Sandy. How had that ended up in Harold's apartment? Janet theorized that Dee Ellen had been trying to prove her innocence to Harold, showing that she loved Sandy. By comparing the image of a 3-hole punch along the sides of the pages, Janet determined that the copy of the card and the copy of the photo of Dee Ellen and Don had come from her confidential 2009 presentation to the parole board. But who could have given this to Harold? An attorney? A member of Dee Ellen's family? The biggest shock for Deb was learning where all his money had gone. Harold had cashed out all his annuities, and numbers associated with Jamaican scammers dominated his calls in the last few months. Victims are congratulated for winning the Jamaican lottery or a new car and told to send money to help process their winnings. Between November 15th of 2010 and July 3rd of 2012, Harold had used Western Union to wire $202,996.75 to 5 people in Jamaica. More money went to scammers in Florida, Colorado, and Hawaii. When he refused to pay, the death threats began. The weekend of his mother's funeral, Harold had barricaded himself in his apartment for 3 days, believing there was a sniper on top of a nearby firehouse, ready to kill him if he left. When the social worker visited, she noticed that he kept a baseball bat close at hand as he opened the door. The investigators talked to a female neighbor who had seen Harold the night before his death, and she said that he looked ashen. She swore that Harold had called out her name sometime in the night before his death, but she didn't look out her window because it did not seem like something that Harold would normally do. Ranger Bobo also checked out Dee Ellen's daughter, Michelle, the one who'd been setting up websites for her mother and other inmates. A week before Harold's death, she traveled to Gatesville and visited her mother on both Saturday and Sunday. 5 days later, Michelle flew from Austin to Dallas and stayed Friday night with her father, Robert Gober, who lives in Keller. She returned to Gatesville the following day, the day that Harold died, to visit her mother in prison. Harold's good friend Charles, the one he was supposed to have coffee with, was at the prison too. After having seen his buddy's corpse that morning, he'd gone to visit his wife, Carlene, who, it should be noted, was one of Dee Ellen's closest friends in prison, and on the night she murdered her husband, had to be admitted to a hospital after ingesting a dangerous mix of barbiturates and Benadryl. At the prison, Charles gave Dee Ellen and Michelle the news about Harold's death. According to Robert's statement to Ranger Bobo, When his daughter Michelle spent the night at his house, she didn't mention that she'd visited her mom twice the weekend before. And after that weekend, she didn't say a word to him about the death of her mother's great benefactor until Ranger Bobo started asking questions. In fact, he'd never heard of Harold, ever. Assigned D'Ellen's power of attorney, Michelle did make an attempt to collect on Harold's estate for her mother, but the money was gone. A year after Harold's death, Ranger Bobo and Lieutenant Inocencio finally interviewed D'Ellen. Bobo assured D'Ellen that she wasn't in any trouble. There was nothing to indicate his death was anything other than natural. The recorded interview is a disturbing look at the psyche of D'Ellen, a con artist who would tell someone she loved her, even as she was plotting her murder. D'Ellen praised Harold as a great friend. I was all that he had, she said. Then, in the next breath, she suggested that he'd been a child molester. That must be why his children want nothing to do with him. I lived with a whole house of child molesters, and none of them will admit that they are child molesters, said D'Ellen. D'Ellen said the idea that she would have lived with Harold when she got out was ridiculous. For more than a decade, they chatted with a sheet of plexiglass between them. I would never have had a contact visit with him or anything like that. I just wouldn't have. Harold never gave her substantial money, she claimed. She denied he was incompetent by any stretch of the imagination, but described him as delusional at times. She admitted that he had made her his sole heir. I didn't think too much about that because he didn't have anything, a statement that is clearly contradicted by her letters to Harold. D'Ellen provided some interesting details, mentioning that Harold often drank Japanese nani juice, any kind of herbal remedy that would make him look younger or grow more hair. The bright green material in Harold's stomach was never identified. She also said that he had terrible allergies and took Claritin and Allegra. Ranger Bobo and Lieutenant Inocencia danced around the manner of Harold's death. A bad heart, not as healthy as he led you to believe. D'Ellen asked, "Why don't you just tell me how he died?" For some reason, though, the investigators never tell her about the huge dose of Benadryl. They questioned her about a Valentine's Day card that D'Ellen had sent Harold 2 days before his death that said, "My heart belongs to you." Why send a Valentine's Day card so early? She insisted several times it wasn't a Valentine, just a note card she had handy. "How would you benefit with Harold not being here on this planet?" Ranger Bobo finally asked her. "Oh, there's no benefit to me for him not being here," she said. Except that she thought she'd receive an annuity valued at $164,000, plus whatever he had in various bank accounts. And her daughter had tried to collect for her, but Jamaican scammers had beaten her to the punch. 3 days after interviewing D'Ellen, Lieutenant Inocencia took his own life, raising the question of whether he was truly able to investigate the case properly.
That's the third suicide.
Mm-hmm. And the Texas Rangers declined to make Ranger Bobo available for any of this material.
They needed him to stay alive.
They didn't want him to die. A week after Lieutenant Inocencia took his own life, the inquiry was closed. This was closed as an accidental death of an old man who'd bankrupted himself with his poor decisions. In late 2014, D'Ellen came up for parole for the second time. Deb and Janet both filed protests and parole was denied, and D'Ellen was given another 5-year set-off till 2019. Harold's old friend Charles died in May of 2017 after several years in memory care, according to his relatives. His prison wife and her kids inherited his estate. His death leaves Deb with more questions that will probably never be answered. Charles, it turned out, lied to investigators, saying he'd known Harold for only a few months. But Charles had known Harold for years and usually stayed at his apartment when he came to visit his prison wife. She wanted to know if he had spent the night with Harold before he died. From the beginning, assumptions made about Harold's death colored the investigation. Records show that Harold's phone was used after his death to call his voicemail. Deb thought this was important, and they missed it. The cremate me note, especially, haunts Deb and Dallas. They think whoever gave their father the Benadryl wanted the evidence destroyed. "I think he was tricked into drinking something," Dallas says, "but I don't know how they got him to write that note. Or did he? There's no indication it was ever fingerprinted or examined by any type of handwriting expert." D'Ellen is up for parole again, And Judy says her sister is in poor health. D'Ellen is innocent, she says. She was railroaded by a jealous sister, and I pray every day that she'll be released in November of 2019. But failure to accept responsibility for her crime or to show remorse and her attacks on the parole board will work against her. And so will Janet Hawley and Deb Berner, two self-taught detectives bound by their belief that they know what kind of woman D'Ellen Bella really is. So that's the end of her story for now. D'Ellen, as I previously mentioned, is still in prison. I went through and started tracking down a lot of information about this case because this is the only mystery for me, like this part of it that we were just talking about here. And I don't know how much of it I can say on the recording, but if she's responsible for his death, meaning Harold's death, then that means there's a murderer walking around free. And,
right, or he died.
Or she... Yeah, or she's still alive. I don't know.
Whoever she got to do it
right.
They were alive. They weren't brought to justice, is what we're getting at.
Yeah. So a lot has changed with regard to who now visits D'Ellen Bella. Who now visits D'Ellen Bella? But just looking at this is like a crazy story, right?
The thing that I guess it really bothers me because, everything about poor Harold's end of life is just terrible because he worked really hard his whole life and then everybody wanted to squander him out of his money. And unfortunately, I didn't realize that in 2012-ish that I thought everybody knew by then, don't wire money to scammers.
That's one of the things that makes me think that Harold was really gullible as he was falling for that. And I don't know who, I can't tell what part was played in all of that by essentially Michelle and D'Ellen.
It seems very coincidental that he could have so many people coming at him like that, to the point where, he was too scared to leave his apartment to go to his mother's funeral. And I know that there's a point of pride that he couldn't bring himself to tell one of his children what the problem was, because clearly, I would like to say no one was trying to kill you, except he ended up dead. Well, what does that mean? Well, he trusted the wrong people. I have no idea what would drive someone to be this manipulative, but you said, do I think these people would have continued to commit crimes? Well, they did, or at least she did. And while she's simultaneously trying to get parole, she's orchestrating the death of someone else. Now, in the article, it says that Harold had told Deb, his daughter, that when D'Ellen got out of jail, that she would make Dallas a millionaire and it would provide enough money for all the grandkids to go to school. Do you remember that sort of paraphrase quote? Okay. And so, you know what I thought? I was like, well, I wonder who she's getting the insurance policy on to kill to make that happen. Was it Dallas's wife?
That's what I thought when I read it. I thought it was either Harold or Lori.
Now, the suicides are a whole different thing because you've got her son, Michael, you've got one of the attorneys that worked the case, and then was he a ranger or let's see?
He was a Gatesville police officer. You're talking about the lieutenant?
So you've got 3 people who commit suicide throughout this entire saga. These articles were some of the longest and hardest to read articles I've ever gone through, but I couldn't look away.
Well, so this story doesn't really make a lot of media news. That's the real reason I wanted to cover this, because
Especially not the entire story.
right, like, so what we pieced together here is again, D Magazine. There's one author who stays on it for like a couple of updates and a couple of like little bits and pieces through the years. But like basically, she, in my mind, she has about 20, almost 30 years with this story. She's about 30 years with this story. And I wanted to put it all out there as a podcast because people mispit, like even the Aaron Brockovich episode when it aired, there's more stuff that like doesn't get put with it because it hasn't happened yet. And like they ran this stuff. It was brilliant what the Tim Rogers and Glenna Whitley did at the Dallas Magazine. They ran these updates where they coincided in time with Bella's parole dates. So basically, she would be up for parole, and the week before, there'd be a cover story. But outside of that, these stories haven't really been told because so many people died.
So many people died. Nobody wants to be putting ideas in anybody's head. A lot of the things are circumstantial. In fact, I don't know with 100% certainty that without Janet Hawley stepping up and presenting the case to the grand jury, I don't know that she ever would have been indicted. I'd like to think the ranger would have done something, but I'm just not sure, because if he was going to do something, why did she have to do it? Well, if the ranger was going to present the case to the grand jury, why did it ultimately fall on Janet Hawley? Did she think that it was taking too long or something?
Oh, I see what you're saying.
I mean, she had a competent case that she presented to a grand jury who returned indictments against 3 people. Any law enforcement officer that had worked on a case up to that point could have presented that very same case to the grand jury. They could have gone to the prosecutor to have the prosecutor present it to the grand jury. And so I'm saying, because this sister of the victim, she cleaned houses for a living, but because of the Code of Criminal Procedure allowed for anybody to present a case to the grand jury, she was able to do this. And obviously this was like an execution style murder case. This was something worthy of the grand jury's attention, right? Having done that successfully, it makes me wonder, like, well, since she was able to do it, why didn't anybody else do it before she had to? Because it seems to me like that would be the last resort, right? It would be the absolute last resort for a person who isn't a professional in, law, prosecution, or law enforcement to have to make this presentation. And that's what happened. So I don't know that without Janet, this would have happened.
The more we've gotten into this and the more we've talked about it and sort of gone through, I'm a little torn on how to say this, but here's what I'll say. While I admire the actions of Don Anderson, and I do feel like he tried to do the best with what he had, I think there's an element of what you're saying that's absolutely correct. But here's the other part of it. So you're saying without Janet, like, we wouldn't have all of this, like it wouldn't have been solved. This is the rabbit hole I fell into. I don't know that this is completely solved. First of all, I think that there's someone missing from that first equation, meaning the murder of Sandy Dial. I think there's a missing party.
Would they replace Don?
I think they might replace Don or assist Don. I don't know how that would work. I would think Don would have given them up if he knew who they were. Well,
and I was going to ask you earlier, do you think that if it was, in fact, another person that assisted in the driving of the vehicle, which is the only information we have to say that there was at least 2 perpetrators involved, do you think that if Don had been involved, he would have been able to give her up? And the fact that he didn't give her up indicates he wasn't actually involved and he therefore couldn't give her up?
I thought about that.
That makes more sense, actually, than, because if you've broken up and you're both facing this conspiracy to commit murder charge, like, it makes me wonder if he had had information, I think he would have turned evidence against her.
I think he would have considered that a valid option unless she had a lot of information on him that would have been prohibitive for him to do that. Like, was it going to be worse if he gave her up? Like they'd done other things. Because the thing about people like this, and we run into them every once in a while. Like Blanche Taylor Moore is a great case to look at. But when you run into these people that are not just killing their people that they're sucking into their web, I don't know what you would call them, because they're not the person that is doing the life-sucking vampire force is not a loved one of the other person, but that person thinks they're in love. They think they're in a relationship with this before they become a victim. When you look at people like that, they have a tendency to sort of glom onto others and like make them also be like, if say it was Don. I mean, he's been convicted, so I don't feel like I'm like crossing into bad territory there. But he's been convicted of conspiracy to commit murder. Say it was him. He's part of her web at that point. And usually the webs are not like one or two people. If somehow there were to be found a conspiracy to kill Harold Henry, that means there's another part of this conspiracy that's never been wrapped up. And that probably extends all the way back to Sandy Dial, unless
Right.
it's one of the kids.
Well,
Unless it's a younger person, then that's more complicated.
as the author points out, D'Ellen had a child when she was 14 years old, which I assume is why she's constantly telling people she's 4 years older than she actually is.
Yeah.
That's the only reason I can think of. And so I think that connection would be pretty strong as far as partners in crime or whatever. And it seems to sort of play itself out just in the information that's given. But you said you don't know that the case is solved, and that I was saying that Janet was responsible for solving the case. Well, she got 3 people indicted for conspiracy to commit murder. No one has ever been charged or convicted with murdering Sandy Dial. Nobody has faced justice
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
on that charge. Okay, so what I'm saying is, I don't know that D'Ellen Bella would have gone to jail at all if Janet hadn't stepped up and presented the case to the grand jury. Grand jury had every opportunity to say no to an indictment, right? I mean, that's the whole point of, presenting evidence. And it's my opinion, I haven't seen the stuff, but it's my opinion that there's a lot of evidence in this case to support the idea that because Sandy Dial ended up dead, that and there was this rogue insurance policy with literally D'Ellen Bella's fingerprints all over it, right? That right there is evidence of a conspiracy to commit murder.
So the rabbit hole I almost went down, and like I'm not going to just keep belaboring this, because I know this is, first of all, thank you for coming down and like letting me tell this through different sources that we've used, like letting me put all this like together in one spot, because I don't think a lot of people link it together. I find it very interesting. I know it's not necessarily your thing. I appreciate you coming along for that ride. That's the first part. The second part is, I think this is the first case I've ever looked at and gone, that would be a scary fucking rabbit hole to go down. And I say that, like, I looked at it from the perspective of, what if the accomplice is still out there? What if they also do this? Like, what if they also have people that they have insurance policies on who don't even realize this is still happening? And
well, the good news is, I don't think that's the case. I think that D'Ellen Bella is the puppet master, the mastermind behind everything. And you've got a puppet that doesn't have a puppet master. What are they capable of doing? Nothing, right?
Yeah.
They're just puppets. Okay. And so the bond that somebody would share with their puppet master is what drives them. They don't have like the independent motivation, right?
Yeah.
they do it for the other person. Now, D'Ellen Bella is the worst type of offender. She sees pretty much everybody around her as disposable people.
Yeah.
And she makes no, and here's the thing that really just irritates the snot out of me. And I know it's not the right way to look at it, but like, she ends up killing Harold thinking she's going to get this like $164,000 annuity or whatever. So he dies, and then like the annuity's gone.
Yeah.
Okay. Same thing with Sandy. When she, killed Sandy, she ultimately didn't get any of that life insurance money. Why is she not realizing that this doesn't work? Why is she continuing to do this? Because to me, like, if my life were to be sacrificed because somebody's stupid and wanted money, at least for the love of God, get the money.
I don't know why she keeps doing it, but I do find myself questioning if I believe that she would stop.
She's not going to stop.
I think she still could potentially be.
She's probably doing something like this right now.
And that's the thing. So,
except for like us talking about this based on these like obscure kind of not mainstream media articles, like nobody knows about this, right? She hasn't been charged with Harold's death, right? Harold's death it continued to be suspicious, I think, or accidental?
Accidental.
One of the investigators working the case committed suicide after they were interviewed. I hope, now it seems to me like Janet and Deb have, apprised the pardons and parole board of the situation, where it is very important to understand and to consider the fact that while trying to get out on parole, she is simultaneously committing like the very crime that she is in prison for to begin with again. And that was orchestrating a scam to collect money, conspiring to commit murder to collect insurance money.
Thank you for joining us. We are sponsored by LabRottiCreations.com. You can check them out at LabRottiCreations.com, and you can still use the code CRIMEXS for a fun pop pet portrait of your own pet. You can also reach us on Twitter, Instagram at TrueCrimeXS, or you can give us a call if you know anything about any of the cases that we're talking about at 252-365-5593. You can also reach us at Gmail at truecrimexs@gmail.com, and you can check out our website at www.truecrimexs.com. We'll see you next time.
This is True Crime XS.
I could tell you that, I believe there's a strong possibility Don Dial is innocent, or I could tell you that now would be the time for something like Final Justice with Aaron Brockovich, which only ran for 3 seasons from like 03 to 06, to pick up this story and run with it. But there's no petitions out there. There's no calls for anything to happen here. These people are still in prison. Don Dial could be innocent. I mean, he did some sketchy stuff, but I don't know that he would have done the crime that he's convicted for. I don't think he could have possibly had anything to do with the rest of it. But what I do think is that Harold Henry was murdered. That's what I think. And I think that there's a killer running around.
shadows in corners of your mind. Pretend you